Hey everyone, welcome back for another lecture. We're going to be discussing Module 67 today, talking about depressive disorders, specifically major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. So we're going to analyze these, talk about some of the symptoms according to DSM-5, why is it where it is in the DSM-5, and then we're going to look at some of the perspectives from the cognitive side and the biological side of things. We're also going to talk about some of the risk factors of suicide and how suicide plays a major role in these specific disorders. So, what are mood disorders? How prevalent are they in today's society? Well, mood disorders are just emotional extremes of mood, right? And two common forms that we're going to look at in detail today will be major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. So, major depressive disorder and bipolar disorders are classified as two very common disorders according to the DSM-5, and you do see parallels, right? You do see certain symptoms that relate and overlap between these disorders. Okay, and those mainly being the fact that within bipolar disorder, you see extreme highs, but also extreme lows. And so these extreme highs are called manic episodes, and we're going to talk about that as we get into this. But major depressive disorder is going to be those extreme lows. So there's parallel between that, right? You see the extreme highs and the extreme lows in bipolar disorders, and there's two forms of bipolarism, 1 and 2, and we'll talk about the differences between those. Now, why are mood disorders located where they're at within the DSM-5? Why are they right next to psychotic disorders? Well, there is actually reason for this, okay? And the main reason being that there are certain symptoms that overlap between the two, especially bipolar 1 and specific psychotic disorders such as schizoaffective disorder. So schizoaffective disorder, it's similar to schizophrenia. However, you see these manic episodes and major depressive episodes that happen. Whereas in schizophrenia, you don't necessarily see these mood disruptions of extreme highs and extreme lows. So that's why it is where it is. You won't be tested on schizoaffective disorder, but just to give you some understanding that there is some thought that goes into the categorization of these disorders in the DSM-5. Okay, so major depressive disorder is a state of hopelessness lasting for several weeks or longer, and it's not generally caused by any sort of prescription drugs. Okay, some of your common symptoms are located here on this part of the screen. This is also in your book, but basically you've got extreme sadness, you've got emptiness, irritability, cognitive disruptions, sleep disruptions, appetite disruptions, and this one here at the bottom, suicide. Okay, thoughts of suicide. So this is where major depressive disorder is different from, say, some of your other more common depressive disorders like disruptive mood dysregulation disorder or persistent depressive disorder or dysthymia, also known as dysthymia. Dysthymia, which I'll mention in the next slide, you don't have those suicidal thoughts, whereas major depressive disorder, you actually do have consistent, frequent thoughts of suicide. So this is there's a lot of biological explanation behind major depressive disorder. It's not that people just have an unoptimistic or negative outlook on life. Okay, other things we see here is the time of year where this is more prevalent than other times, and that's in December versus August. And the reason for that is something called seasonal affective disorder. This is something we're all affected by, but it especially affects people with major depressive disorder. And it's related to light, not temperature, but light. Okay, so these are U.S. statistics. So generally speaking, in the U.S., we don't have monsoon season. Okay, we have hurricane season. It's a different time of year, and it only hits the coastal cities in certain parts of the U.S. But August is really sunny most of the time in most places. December is very cloudy. Okay, it's very cold, it's very cloudy, but important thing to remember about seasonal affective disorder, SAD is the acronym for that, is that it's related to light. Even in Hong Kong, right, when it's cloudy for long periods of time, people with major depressive disorder experience significant amount of symptoms during those times. So depression is the common cold of psychological disorders. It's really the number one reason people seek mental health. And on a lot of accounts, it's actually very underdiagnosed and undertreated. Okay, this is dysthymia or dysthymic disorder, PDD, persistent depressive disorder. Generally speaking, it's more intense than a blue mood, but it's less intense than major depressive disorder. And the reason for that is because you don't have those suicidal thoughts related to your down in the dumps mood. So yeah, some of your common symptoms, you've got low energy, low self-esteem, difficulty concentrating, you're going to have poor appetite or overeating, your sleep is going to be disrupted, you're going to sleep too little or you're going to sleep too much. So these are some of the common symptoms of dysthymia. There's also genetic predispositions here. If your parent has this, it significantly could increase the risk of you also inheriting those genetic traits. Generally speaking, you'll see the symptoms start appearing in early teens or early adulthood. Now, bipolar disorder, formerly known as manic depressive disorder. So you may hear people say manic depressive disorder, or they might say bipolar disorder. It's basically the same thing. And you have this alteration between depression and mania, right? Whereas major depressive disorder, you just have that extreme low of depression, right? Bipolar disorder is a little different in the sense that you've got depression, extreme lows, and then you got mania, extreme highs. So within bipolar disorder or manic depressive disorder, you have two different categories. You got bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. All right, bipolar 1, you're going to experience at least one episode of mania as well as episodes of major depression. Bipolar 2, you're not going to experience mania. Instead, you're going to experience something called hypomanic episodes. And as you can see here on this chart, you've got the time span and the intensities, okay, normal mood, hypomania, mania, and then below mild depression, severe depression. You can see here on the timeline, obviously in bipolar 1, the depressive states are much longer versus here, so they're a bit more intense, and then it's pretty obvious manic episodes are far more intense than hypomanic episodes seen down here in bipolar 2. And then between these mood swings, you do have normal states, right? Normal periods where they go through and experience normal emotional life. So what are the biological explanations for these two disorders, depressive disorders, mood disorders, and bipolar disorders? Well, genetic influences is a major one, right? And we see that mood disorders generally run in the family, which is kind of why we would say here, like the linkage analysis associates with genetic influences, right? The linkage analysis is just looking at possible gene factors that carry over from generation to generation and show some sort of association between these dispositions for these mood disorders. And when looking at the specifics of the genetic influences, you've got predispositions, okay, neurochemical imbalances related to your neurotransmitters, and then nutritional deficits. We need to be eating healthy, right? If we want to be able to overcome these illnesses, and that's important regardless. If you have mental illnesses, if you have physical illnesses, you should be eating healthy as well. But we should always be eating healthy. Now, this graph here is looking at it's just explaining the genetic factor related to twin studies. So looking at identical twin studies, researchers estimated the heritability of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anorexia nervosa, major depressive disorder, and general anxiety disorder. And so they were looking at the percentage and the variation due to these genetic influences regarding these twin studies. And obviously they found that having any of these disorders in a sibling or a parent is going to significantly increase the possibility or the likelihood that you may also inherit that genetic gene, that trait. And when looking at two specific ones that we've been talking about here, you've got major depressive disorder. It looks like it's close to a 40% chance that if an identical twin has this disorder, the other twin will also have it. And then when looking at bipolar disorder, it's almost an 80% chance that the identical twin will also inherit that same gene. That kind of explains the genetic side of things. And then when looking at neurotransmitter influences, we see that depressive disorders and bipolar disorder are related to two specific neurotransmitters. That would be norepinephrine and serotonin. These are oftentimes found in depression and also in mania, right, in bipolar disorders. So norepinephrine increases arousal. So whenever we have a boost in our mood, that means our norepinephrine is increased. So if we have a scarcity of that, we're going to be depressed, right? We're going to be in a low mood. And overabundance of that is going to lead to manic episodes, right? Hyperactivity. Whereas when we look at serotonin, this is going to be scarce when we're inactive, right? So we're going to have less of that being produced, and therefore that will increase our depression. So we need to find significant ways to decrease our stress by becoming more active, looking for factors to become more active to help this serotonin controlling gene and get out of those depressed states. So that's why being active is really important when you're going through depressive phases and mood swings, so that you can balance those norepinephrine and serotonin out so that you're at a healthy mood state. Okay, here are some images of a PET scan. I'm looking at it again from a biological sense, and these are top-facing PET scans looking at the energy consumption of the rise and fall, all right, of these patients' emotional switches. And so PET scans are going to show the brain energy consumption of glucose, right, the chemical fuel, and basically the active neurons in the brain just gobble up this glucose, and you can see a good representation of what's going on in the brain at that specific time. So kind of like how we look at the weather radar, right? And you see all these different colors. It's similar when looking at a PET scan. So the red areas are where the brain is rapidly consuming glucose, where those neurons are most active. The blue area is going to be where those neurons are less active. Okay, so the social cognitive perspective explores how people's assumptions and expectations lead to what they perceive about themselves, right? And about the world around them, and about the future. And you have this thing called rumination, right? Rumination is going to be related to what can distract us from the good around us, and instead it increases our negativity, it increases our negative emotion, it increases our disruption of our lives relationally, physically, biologically, psychologically, socially. And so there definitely is a cognitive side to explaining mood disorders. Aaron Beck, one of the first to look at this from a cognitive perspective, he believed that faulty thinking is what actually led to depression. And we'll talk about him more when we get into treatment, but he called them cognitive errors, where we've got this triad of, right, three factors. You've got the world, you got self, and then you got the future, and how all of these kind of continue to affect each other. But when we look at it from a social cultural perspective, I think something that also has really influenced the factor in depression increasing, the spikes that we see, is social media. I mean, gosh, I don't know the last time I got on Instagram and then felt good about myself after getting off of it, because I compare myself with everyone on that platform. If it affects me, I'm sure it affects everyone else the same, and there's a lot of research that shows that. So I think from a social, cultural, and cognitive perspective, that also plays a significant role in these depression rates that have spiked recently. So for this last slide here, I want to just talk about one of the greatest problems when looking at these mood disorders, especially major depressive disorder. It oftentimes leads to suicidal thoughts. And 10% of those who deal with these mood disorders, like bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder, actually attempt suicide. Now, looking at these U.S. suicide attempts, women are actually 3 to 4 times more likely, one, to deal with depressive disorders, and 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide. However, on the other hand, men are actually 2 to 3 times more likely to successfully go through with suicide. And so if you look at kind of some of the statistics here, you see, males predominantly have a higher suicide rate than women. And also when you look at the aspect of age, you see this major spike right here from 65 and above. So while we do see, some aspects of suicide increasing in youth, we also see suicide increasing in elderly populations as well. All right, so let's get some practice here with these two categories of disorders that we've been talking about today. So the question is, which of the following is a characteristic of bipolar disorder but not major depressive disorder? So we have low energy levels, high energy levels, an increase in appetite, a decrease in appetite, and a loss of interest in normal activities. So we're looking at what differentiates bipolar disorder from major depressive disorder, right? Well, we know that both of them have elements of low states, right? When we looked at the description of these two disorders, looking at in terms of an increase in appetite and a decrease of appetite, that's not really going to help us differentiate between these two, because when we are in depressive states, we can see an increase in our appetite or a decrease in our appetite, right? Either one of those could happen. Our appetite will generally be affected in depressive states. That's what we do know. A loss of interest in normal activities, that's generally associated with depressive states. So really the only one left that can help us understand what differentiates the two is the high energy levels, right? When we talk about the manic phases, that's going to be associated with bipolar disorders and not with major depressive disorders. So the answer would be B. All right, let's look at one more question here. I'm going to give you a moment to read this, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so you have to be careful with answering this question because they slip in this adverb here, not, right? Would not reasonably be Darren's diagnosis. And so if you had read that quickly and not picked up on how it was phrased here, yeah, you might have answered it incorrectly. So be careful when you're reading these. From what's been told here about Darren, we can't really differentiate whether or not he is experiencing major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. And so we can, however, scratch out schizophrenia, as he doesn't have delusions or hallucinations of the grandeur, right? So the best answer here would be 2 only, right? And options 1 and 3 may be possible within Darren's diagnosis. So kind of just wanted to give a final thought regarding this sensitive issue that we're talking about here regarding depressive states. I know that some of you are going through depressive states in your life or on medication for this specific disorder. And while we have focused on the weaknesses, and while you may feel very weak at times, remember that there are also strengths seen in this as well. It's an opportunity for you to overcome. And if you don't deal with it yourself, it's an opportunity for you to come alongside maybe a friend or a family member who is dealing with depression and help them overcome it. And so we can come together and better one another, right? That's what a community is for, whether it's depressive states or any other event that someone goes through, right? We all have a disorder, essentially, and we can look at that through the fact that we all have sin. So we all have brokenness in our lives, and we need people. We need social integration. So don't isolate yourself. I'm here if you need someone to just listen. I know Ms. Fong is here for you. I know your tribe teacher is there for you. Your friends are there for you, your family. Find someone you trust. Reach out to them. They're going to help you more than you can imagine. And if anything, I can definitely pray for you. So thanks for watching today. I'll see you guys later.